you kind of do have to love your own playing or believe with some degree of conviction that you have the potential to add something really meaningful to a recording.
Welcome to the Acoustic Guitar Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Grizzle, and in today's episode, I'm joined by co-host Elton Bradman and two special guests, Joe Gore and Molly Miller. The four of us had a lively and fascinating conversation all about recording acoustic guitars. Both Gore and Miller are seasoned studio pros who have been in sessions with major artists. For Gore, that includes musicians like Tracy Chapman, Tom Waits, PJ Harvey, and Amy Mann. And Miller has been in the studio with Jason Mraz and her own Molly Miller guitar trio, and she's a professor of studio guitar at USC. Suffice to say, they have a lot of knowledge and were very willing to share it. Before we dive in, I'd like to thank G7th, the capo company, for sponsoring this episode. The G7th Performance 3 guitar capo is the culmination of years of designing, tweaking, and improving, but most importantly listening to guitarists and their views on what a capo should do. Now, coupling their unique tension control system with the groundbreaking adaptive radius technology, or ART, string pad mechanism gives a near-perfect capo experience, complete control over the pressure placed on your strings, and phenomenal tuning stability. For more information about the Performance 3 and other ranges of G7th capos, go to g7th.com. Now, without further ado, enjoy our Get Recording Ready episode. Our guests begin the conversation detailing their acoustic recording bona fides.
So I've done some acoustic recording at home, but I also have been in the studio for different things. I feel like the most notable acoustic thing with my face on it is I did some work with Taylor for some acoustic renditions of Disney songs. That I did it. So I did a few of those, but yeah, just working with different artists, recording, and then I'll record from home sometimes acoustic as well.
Well, I started out as an acoustic guitarist. I was a classical musician gone bad, and I'm probably more known as an electric guitarist, but I played acoustic on gazillion sessions. Tom Waits, Tracy Chapman, PJ Harvey, and I have a lot of experience recording, normal sounding acoustic guitars and not so normal sounding ones.
Cool. So we thought about maybe breaking this up into 3 sections: before, during, and after recording. And let's start with getting mentally prepared, because before you even touch the guitar, you have to be in the right headspace, right?
I'm going to suggest even backing up a stage more in generality. And, the big question is, for whom are you recording? Who's in charge? Are you the artist and recordist and producer? Are you trying to please other people? There's just so many possible ways that you could go into a recording session. If it's recording session with an artist, it might involve doing a lot of research in their previous music if you haven't heard it, and seeing what sort of things they've done in the past. If you're recording by yourself in your home studio, it's a whole different world. You can suck as much as you like and take as long to get it right. And if the clock's ticking, it's got to sound pretty good on the first take. So the mental preparations might be very different depending on the context of the recording.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I personally, I think prefer having someone else being the engineer because, just talking about the mental state, I think it's one less thing to be distracted by, and to be consumed by is like making sure all those elements, because it really is two jobs. And so often now I think, we are doing multiple jobs at once. But it's nice just to be the guitarist. And yeah, checking out the artist, who is it for? And I feel like also having options. Sometimes I like to go into a session, if it's special, mine or not mine. Mine more so I know what I want, but if it's someone else's, having options, so you're not married to one thing because it's not what you want per se. It's not your vision, it's someone else's vision that you're helping create, and hopefully, your voice is still in it.
Oh, Molly, I could not agree with that more. That's very wise. I too hate being my own engineer, but I am almost all the time. So, but it's grim reality. But in terms of the artist, I think you hit on something really key, which is if I'm working with an artist and don't know exactly what to expect, but say maybe I've heard some demos or something, I'll go in with a stack full of ideas. But I find that the harder part isn't concocting ideas as much as it is responding in the moment. And sometimes the idea that is genius, the producer's saying, oh, let's try something else. I've blown it a few times by trying to explain the genius of my idea. And really, so like having a lot of ideas on tap, but then being able to just throw it all out the window and just dive in. I find that a very challenging mental leap to make, and it's taken me a long time to learn how to do it.
Yeah, I had a challenging situation recently where I was playing for an artist, and she kind of she was like, you do you. She had heard me recording a different thing, and she was like, I love what you do. Like, come in and do your thing. And, it was like a live recording. So an amazing bassist and drummer as well. And the three of us were just recording live. And I was like, yeah, I crushed it, like perfect. And the engineer walks out and the producers are like, great. All of you guys sounds perfect. And she's like, yeah, no, I don't like what you're doing, Molly. And I was like, what? Like me? And like, she had bad demoitis and she was not a guitar player and played on it. So she had all these things that were out of time and not decisions I would ever make that were like very, but it was her song. And so it was this it was so challenging because I had played something. She'd be like, how do I put this? Play it more out of time. Can you not play it well? And that was one of the more challenging recording situations I have had.
Demoitis is a real thing, and as bad as it is in a music session, it's 10 times worse when you're working on a soundtrack, because then they will have watched their film 2,000 times in preparation, and they can completely say, this is just temp. It's, you do you, and what they want is the temp score. I know. And if I were a filmmaker, I'd probably fall prey to that too. But yeah, I hear you, and that's been really hard sometimes.
Yeah, it's like really being egoless, which is an impossible thing to do sometimes, as what we do is so closely attached to our egos. But that's the mental part of it too.
Well, I look at fellow musicians. I'm kind of focusing on the studio world, and I realize we should maybe be addressing more home recordists, like most of us are. But when I've done studio sessions with session players who are far more successful and get hired a lot more than I do, it is truly the egolessness. I've never been able to defeat my egotism, but I've certainly been humbled a lot over the years.
Yeah. So when you're going into the studio or when you're recording your own stuff, do you have a sound in mind ahead of time, and how do you deal with that changing?
If someone nicks it, I let it go. Because especially, to me, that's when you're being a good contributor to a record, or that's when you're being a good participant, is understanding it's not you. Whoever's vision it is, I think listening to them is super important. So I let go of things. And also I know it's not recording per se, but this last week we started a new song. I'm on tour right now with Jason Mraz, and we were working with a new song, or like reviving an old song. And I had been attached to some of the things I had done before. And the piano player was like, Molly, I don't think you should do that. I think this other thing would help fill out the sound more. And I was like, I really love what I was doing before. And then like I listened back to the recording. I was like, he's right. So it's like not about me playing these like cool little like trill lines that I love, but instead doing power chords because that's what the song was called for. And yeah, and I find it's easiest to do that. You know, in a situation where it's not just one thing. But even in general, I think if someone says no, I don't struggle with holding on to it. If I, you know, yeah, you're not the only voice in the room.
I see a pattern to this interview, which is I'm just basically going to say everything Molly said is brilliant. we're kind of I think playing from an overlapping set of experiences. But to bring it back to home recording, let's say you're working on a piece and recording it at home, and you're doing it all, yeah. And you have no one to answer to. To echo Molly, a lot of times it's playback. A lot of times I don't record that stuff as much as I should, but I'm starting to getting in the habit. Even if it's just recording on a voice memo thing, I have a voice memo recorder on my wristwatch, and I'm just trying to get in the habit of, you know, hitting it when things are going. And then I come back and, you know, listen at the end of the day or first thing the next day, and things that you can have a lot of anguish over sometimes just become crystal clear. Like, I was trying so hard and that just doesn't work. Back to the drawing board. Or vice versa. Something you might have played that you just thought was a mediocre idea in passing might really hold up later. It's so hard to maintain listening objectivity over the course of a recording session or mixing session. Our ears are a moving target. We literally, what we hear literally differs. You know, and after an hour of playing music and after 2 hours of playing music, it's probably exaggerated in my case because I'm a lot older than Molly. But our ears do fluctuate, and having, you know, some kind of objective measure, even as just like a crappy little voice memo recording, can shine a light where there was previously nothing but darkness.
I love that line. Our ears are a moving target. I have never heard that, and it's so true. You know, like 1 minute you think something's amazing, and you listen back a day later or whatever. You're like, what was I thinking?
A lot of that I developed not from, you know, sessions or recording, but from writing gear reviews for other guitar magazines since the dawn of the time. And especially when you say anything negative about a product, you gotta back it up with facts, you know, audio or audio analysis charts or something like that. And also, not to pimp my stuff too much, but I have a small guitar pedal company, and doing that work of, you know, sitting at the bench for an hour, going back and forth between two different transistors, you just sometimes can't decide in one session because what you're hearing when you started is literally not what you heard when you began.
It's amazing. It's like, you know, what you guys are talking about is reminding me of producing oneself. Like, that's like a whole nother skill set of being the artist and being the producer and going back and forth between those things.
Yeah. You know, I started doing this thing some years back, and I feel like in like grad school or college, trying to listen back to recordings of myself as if it's not me. Because it's a weird thing. You listen differently. We are so much more judgmental of ourselves. And I find if I'm listening to another guitar player, I'm not picking out the wrong note, but I instead listening to it as a whole. So when I listen back to myself, I really try to do that. And I don't always accomplish it, but yeah.
You know, I think of all those, all the great session players who come out with solo albums. And it's almost like, for me, as a listener and music journalist and as a bass player, there's like a certain subgenre of solo albums by session musicians. And I'm constantly thinking, okay, so they've been in this world and touched by these things, and now they decided, hell no, on my solo recording, I'm going to do completely the opposite, or it sounds like what they've spent time recording. You know what I mean? So I was just wondering.
There are probably a lot of good albums in that category, but they're not coming to mind right away. But all the bad ones sure are. I think often it's as simple as, here's all the wanking they wouldn't let me do on the session, or they wouldn't let me do on stage. Now I'm just gonna, go full on and just follow my vision, and sometimes the vision is really vulgar and unattractive. Like certain session players, benefit from working with great artists and great producers to shape the ideas, and to varying degrees, the player's relationship with the artist and or the producer, who may or may not be two people, or who may or may not share the same agenda, is so case by case, and sometimes you're getting your direction shaped a lot. When I work with Tom Waits, he's astonishing at that, because he never gives a specific musical direction. He never says anything like play it up an octave or whatever, but he's standing in front of you, like literally twitching. He's very hyperkinetic, and it's almost like he's shaping the clay with his hands and saying, a little more this, a little more that, a little more that, a little more that. And in the end, he hasn't suggested a note. And I guess technically I, quote, made up the part, but it's a part that wouldn't have existed without that intense feedback. And it really kind of has become their part at that point. Sometimes. And then other artists are like, nah, I don't like that. Try something else.
Yeah. I feel like when you're recording for other people, you have to be so malleable. And I don't know, it's like almost telepathic, because everyone like that's, I feel like what Joe's saying is like, every artist is so different. Sometimes, like, I remember it's like, I want this to sound like an alien came down from space, and you have to understand what that means. Or some people will like sing you an exact part, or and interpreting what the person wants is a whole other skill set.
Yeah. I agree with Molly.
That should be the name of this episode.
Molly talks, Joe nods.
Oh my God, I feel like I'm just agreeing with you too.
Well, last mental preparation question. How do you guys, or have you ever experienced red light fever or jitters before recording?
Yeah, I mean, a couple times come to mind. And for me, sometimes it's random. You don't always know. The last time I had that experience was on that session I was talking about. That was the last time I had it, and I just, my brain couldn't work, because I felt like it was like I was so shocked and like in just like, oh my God, and like then I was kind of freaking out. And typically I feel like that was a weird one. That was the last one. And before I could think, I was doing a demo for an acoustic company, and I just got nervous. And this was a couple of years ago. I find though, things like, first just doing them, like the more you do recordings, like the less scary it is. And the other thing is feeling really prepared. I feel like that is the remedy for me for everything. Recording, live sessions, like whatever it is, solo, working for an artist, is feeling like I know the material well. And like, because then it's not scary. You have this like calmness about you. And I feel like so much of performing well is the mental state, because that allows you to have clear thinking, which is then like you're more connected to your instrument and yourself and your ideas, and you can be present when you're not thinking, oh my God, what's the next chord? Oh God, I should have practiced that more. Like that's the most distracting thing.
So can you break down a little bit of your process as you go into a session? Are you shedding the material in all 12 keys and trying different instruments and making sure your strings are fresh, and like on a really basic logistical level, what's your prep?
Yeah, I mean, I think knowing the music well, and I recorded and listened back to myself to make sure I like how it sounds, even just a little voice memo, and it is almost like a little, it does add pressure. If it's a piece, like one cohesive piece, like I'll sometimes perform it for other people, depending what it is. Like I remember on the Taylor session, I was nervous. There were like solo guitar arrangements that I had to get in one cut that were pretty intricate.
That's intense. That's intense. That's about as intense as it gets.
So yeah, solo guitar chord melody pieces that like people know the melody for, and I had really made it intricate arrangements. So like that I'd like play for other people. That's part of it too. Recorded myself listening back a bunch. So things like that. And then if it's like a session for someone else, not necessarily like doing it in all 12 keys, but having multiple ideas, I'd say. And also just like feeling good, like it's like basic things that I think are just like life things, like getting a good night's sleep. For me, maybe it's like going on a jog in the morning and making sure I'm like not hungry. It's like all these things that are just life things that I think are so important. Sleep, eat, exercise, practice your guitar. And then like, you're going to be cool.
That's a t-shirt. I can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what my take on red light fear is, because I'm generally pretty fearless, or so I used to think. And and just a lot of times that pressure brought out the best. It brought out the focus and the intensity. But I don't know anymore, because like I'm 65 years old now. And earlier this year, I had my first experience playing a concerto as a soloist in front of a large major orchestra, and I was a complete wreck. My friends had to comfort me. I was sleeping poorly. I got shingles after the session, even though I'd had the vaccine, and I just had like the most, in that particular context, I had like stage fright like I'd never had before. So I used to brag about being fearless, but now I know the truth is I'm a wuss.
No, but I think that in my experience, I mean, you've done it more than me, but like it sneaks up in weird times. Like I remember I was doing an acoustic session with just a vocalist, me and her. It was a little live thing, like playing open chords and strumming. And I don't know what happened. And that was the one that freaked me out, that I got nervous in a moment that didn't make any sense to be nervous. Yeah, because most of the time, like, I don't feel like I have struggled with nerves, but for the most part, I'm pretty good about it. And I think it's like the more you do something correct, or like you don't freak out, the more you understand like, oh, this is just, I can do this. And I do agree with Joe where it's like the adrenaline of something I think helps and makes you present. Like I always say, I like to be a little scared going on stage, and not scared maybe is the right word, but a little just like on my toes. Because I do think when you're like, I have to be present, I can't be thinking about other things, like it makes you better, like that little bit of adrenaline. But it can go the other way, which is the red light freak out, which sometimes sneaks up in funny moments that I'm like, what? Yeah, but then I'd say, I don't know, like stop, breathe, do something. I don't know.
This is a tricky thing to discuss, because it deals with the border between humility and pride. I have a lot of friends who are famous guitarists, lots more famous and successful than I am or ever will be. And even then there's always this kind of, kind of putting down your own playing, or making these jokes about, I'm a guitar polisher, not a guitar player. And it's this kind of autopilot modesty that's really kind of bogus. And I think, you, in a lot of ways, you will never learn if you don't have a certain degree of humility. But I also think that at a certain point, you kind of do have to love your own playing, or believe that you have, yes, not that you're always right, but believe that you have something to say and like it, and believe with some degree of conviction that you have the potential to add something really meaningful to a recording. And the more and more experience you get, the more instances you can look back on where you did manage to do that, and the ones where you didn't. So I'm not suggesting a sort of bullheaded pride, but just nix the self-abasement. And if you're doing it, presumably you've got something to say, and it's not a question of your technique or whatever. It's just believing that you have a voice that, if you're lucky, will be the right voice for the occasion.
I love that. Actually, a week or two ago, we were in Interlaken playing, and we had a bunch of, like, there was a songwriting class there. And Jason said this thing that was like, struck me, talking about, he's like, I'm my favorite songwriter, and like, he's not an egotistical guy, but he was just like saying this thing. And I was like, I kind of love that. Like, you should be your favorite guitar player, not like in an egotistical way, but you should, like what Joe's saying, like feel like you have something to say and like like the way you sound, love the way you sound. It's like, and even saying that out loud, like, feels like, God forbid you say, I love my guitar playing. Like, it's like, you're not supposed to, but I don't know. We dedicate our life to this thing. We should value what we do.
Yeah. There's a difference between saying like, I'm the best at something and saying, I love what I do. Like, I love the art that I make.
Returning to something Ben asked a while ago about basic preparations. It's a really good question, but it's answered pretty simply. I mean, be healthy. If you have an opportunity to study the music, bring paper or an iPad and something to write on and take notes. Bring whatever tools you might have in your toolbox. Like, I do a lot of acoustic EBow playing, and I wouldn't go to an acoustic session without an EBow, for example. But that stuff is most of that stuff is horse sense. Though there's one that's really controversial. I think it's less controversial among people who do it for a living. But you'd mentioned fresh strings, and boy, that's one of the great. That's like talking about tone wood. It's like one of the most divisive topics you can bring up in guitar and guitar recording. And personally, I'm an advocate on really comfortably stretched out, worn in strings, and that generally fresh strings introduce more problems than they address. But you'll find people far greater than me who will walk in and wouldn't do a session without a fresh set of strings.
I think for electric, fresh strings, and acoustic, not fresh strings. But the balance, like I hate crusty strings. I can't touch a guitar that has crusty strings on it, is my personal opinion.
Especially if it's somebody else's crust.
I know. And one more note on prep, because I like, now I'm thinking like of some sessions I've done with like scary pockets or stories, like, and all that stuff, which actually is very acoustic based. You go in and you have the song, but you put the song, like, you flip the song upside down, and you don't know what key it's going to be, and you don't know the arrangement. And Pomplamoose too, I've done that with, where it's like, so you can't really prepare to it in a degree, because sometimes we'll be like, actually, let's just change the song and do this song. And that's where I think, like, trusting that you're supposed to be there gives you that clarity of thought, so you can be present and use all the skills that, you have. It's not like your first day on the job. So, yeah.
And for acoustic strings, well, I kind of, when I was younger, I'd go on tour, I would have fresh strings every night, and it felt gross if I didn't. And I really changed that attitude, because it's really wasteful. And part of it is just as simple as, when I was younger, I played with a lot of musicians from West Africa, and they can't change strings every night. They got to make a set of strings last for years. And when the string breaks, they tie a knot in it. And when they can't tie any more knots in it, they unwind a bicycle cable and use those wires as strings. It's just such a first world thing to burn through strings. So I've moved much, I've shifted away from changing a lot. I use really high-end strings. I use expensive strings, but I really try to make them last a long time. As far as going into a session, too much high-end on acoustic tends to be a bigger problem than the opposite. And depending on your technique, or whether you're playing with your fingers or with your picks, the new strings can introduce a lot more string noise. For me, if I had a session that was really important for me coming up, and I really wanted my instrument to sound its best, I would probably change the strings maybe 48 hours before the session, and do a lot of, and really play them in, and put 4-6 hours on them. And to me, that's kind of like when a string is at its peak. And I'm kind of similar with electric guitar, but I'm weird in that for me, acoustic guitar and electric guitar are not different instruments.
I understand that, actually. I feel like I often say that I don't like that we think of them so differently. But just, I think I have a thing with changing strings before like a recording session or a big show. I like to change them the day before, maybe 2 days before. And I just have my whole ritual around it. Acoustic less, because sometimes you'll get the really like high tones that I feel like you don't want.
I was just going to say, I honestly don't know if this is a function of taste or a function of age, but the older I get, the darker I want all the acoustic guitars to sound. I feel really, really alienated from super sizzly acoustic guitar, and I want to hear a lot of body warmth and I want to hear the fundamentals of the note really, really strongly, and I need less of the candy shimmer. And I tend to seek out strings that are particularly dark and don't have many overtones. And it's not as crazy as it sounds, because the strings affect each other. And if your low strings are putting out a ridiculous amount of high overtones, or when I say ridiculous, I mean the kind of overtones you get by putting on a normal mainstream set of acoustic guitar strings, the high notes that are coming off the low strings are inevitably going to have phase cancellations and dulling out with the higher strings. And the more the low strings can just focus on the fundamental and leave the field clear for the strings with higher pitches. The ultimate example of that, and excuse me, I'm drifting a little away from acoustic for a moment, is the famous Beatle Birds 12-string sound. How do they make it jangle so much? They make it jangle so much because they were using flat wound strings, and the low strings don't have a lot of overtones on them, and the octave strings have all the room in the world to sing. And if you try it back and forth, and trying to play Ticket to Ride or Mr. Tambourine Man with or without the flat wound strings, it's like a light switch is on. Oh, that's the jangle. And it's not darker. Some strings are darker to let other strings glisten more.
I was going to ask if both of you have done enough recording now that you probably have a preferred signal chain. Maybe not down to the details, but for example, you could say, I've had good results with this mic. I've had good results with this DI. Do you have preferences at this point, and how flexible are you about those?
If I'm going with a producer who I know and trust and respect, or who's paying me, I tend to let them do their job. If Chad Blake is setting up microphones, I'm not going to say anything about how he wants to set up his microphones. But on the other hand, you often go into a session a lot and people might need a little pointers, or they might set up a mic and you kind of subtly adjust it to where you think it sounds right. You mentioned specifically signal chain, and I think there's things that are generally true, and also for those of us who are working in home studios, even if we own some nice gear, it's not like a mic locker at a studio. I mean, unless we're really rich, and so you probably don't have that many choices, and you probably get very accustomed to using and very good at using, particular tools. The conventional wisdom is that small diaphragm condenser mics are the number one choice for acoustic guitars, except there's 10,000 examples where that isn't true. It tends to be my default. I'm going to refer back to what I said earlier about the context mattering, because the musical style can have a lot to do with what signal recording choices you make. That's especially true in whether or not to record in stereo. And there are a lot of times where people think they need stereo and mono is the best solution. And there's times where you really do want that stereo, and there's times where you can create a convincing stereo image out of a mono single. And again, there's a million exceptions, but to speak in the most generalized, averaging out of factors terms, the more instruments are on the track, the more likely I am to use mono. If it's a pop track, like something with, something like with a consistent beat that's meant to sound kind of popular, I do mono, but might double the part left and right in stereo. If it's a solo acoustic recording, you tend to think you want stereo, and I tend to use it, but boy, it's a whole world of decisions about, are you going to do it with XY, or are you going to do it with mid-side rejection? When working in stereo, I've become a real fan of ORTF miking technique, and the acronyms are, it's a French thing, so it's Office de Radiodiffusion Télévision Française.
Wow.
It's something that French radio engineers came up with. And talking about, there's probably three most common stereo miking techniques. One is to set up. I'm using my hands to gesture on an audio podcast. That's brilliant. Let me put.
We'll describe.
One method is to simply set up two microphones at some distance apart, kind of angled in towards the guitar. there's a sometimes popular method called mid-side rejection, where you use two mics literally stacked on top of each other like a little microphone sandwich, and you do phasing tricks to create a stereo image. And ORTF works a lot like a binaural head microphone. In ORTF, you have two mics, maybe 3-4 inches apart, both angling in, and I find that gives a really natural, beautiful stereo image. It's really easy to get too stereo on your acoustic guitars, and there starts to be no center there anymore. And if I want stereo, ORTF always seems to work. It tends not to have phase problems when you mash it down to mono. You can exaggerate or diminish the perceived width with plugins or audio processing tools. And with ORTF, you usually use a specialized mic clip where the mic positions are exact. You can't adjust their angles because they sort of calculate what the right angle is. And I'm a big fan of that technique, but big fan of mono too, man.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Joe. It just depends what it is. Is it you're layering 5 acoustic guitars on or what, with all these different timbres and different parts and octaves of the and whatnot. So versus is it solo guitar, and I feel like different things are called for each. And also, home or at a studio. I mean, I have a limited collection of mics, so I use the limited mics I have, but it works. And I've never had complaints about my acoustic recording jobs. But yeah, definitely go, if it's something more high end, I would go to a studio.
But also to get, it's one of the tragedies about recording acoustic guitar is that unlike on electric guitar, you can get one of the cheapest mics ever made and sound great. A lot of classic recordings were made on a Shure SM57, which is like an $80 microphone. It's not the same on acoustic. If you use a cheaper dynamic mic on acoustic, you might get a sound that's cool. You might get an attitude that's right for the track. Sometimes a horrible sound is the right sound, like very famously the Keith Richards acoustic tone on Street Fighting Man, which was overdriving the preamp in a 1960s cassette recorder. So it kind of sounds like an electric guitar. So lo-fi makes sense, but if you're going for fi, you can do it on a budget. You can I inherited some beautiful Schoeps microphones, which are a very high end small diaphragm condenser that probably cost a little over $3,000 a pair. I was given them by my father-in-law, who used to be a very talented amateur recordist. But if you buy, the Neumann knockoffs, and they kind of have, a lot of them are copied after the Neumann small diaphragm microphone, and you're probably getting 80% of the performance for 20% of the price. You can make, basically a lot of them are just Chinese or Russian clones of German and Austrian mics, and they often work really well. You can make hi-fi good acoustic recording sounds with a pair of blue small diaphragm condensers, which probably cost $250 or $300.
Yeah, I was gonna say it really does depend on the sound you're going for, because sometimes my favorite recordings are really lo-fi, just demos that are raw. I use an AKG 414 often, and I think it sounds great on my acoustic.
Well, that's considered a very high-end studio microphone.
But the one I have is with $800 or something. It's not crazy. You're talking about So to me, that was my gift to myself, and I was now that I'm going to be a serious recorder.
Another thought about, I mentioned in passing doubling, doubling mono guitars on a pop, for a pop sound. And I experienced something a few years ago that really opened my eyes, which is when I would do the doubling, I would really try to make it as exact as possible, really exact. And then the tiny little imperfections where it isn't exactly exact give you this lovely left-right animation in the recording where one chord or one note might stand out and it just sort of percolates. But I always focused on making it really tight. And one of the best techniques for keeping it tight, if you're playing with the ensemble, is follow the hi-hat. Because a lot of time the drummer's hi-hat and the guitar are doing very, very similar things. And there's a great potential for collision of groove. So having said all that about precision, when we started getting to hear all those classic rock recordings split out into individual tracks, there are so many revelations about things you thought people were doing and you were wrong. And one of the most dramatic for me is hearing Johnny Marr tracks with the Smiths split into individual guitars. And a lot of tracks where you might not even know there's an acoustic. Lo and behold, there's 4 acoustic guitars underneath there. And his technique was not precision. They're sloppy as hell. But that's, when he puts together, 10, 12, 16 tracks of guitars that aren't exactly in time, it kind of makes this really compelling smear. And a particularly notable example is the very first Smiths single, This Charming Man, which people think of as an electric guitar song. It's got a prominent electric guitar riff. And I think most people, if asked to guess, would say, how many guitars are you hearing on this track? And, maybe doubled electric, maybe a few little stabs here and there. I'm going to guess 3 guitars. And there's 16 guitars on that song, and you wouldn't know it unless you listened for it. I was flabbergasted when I interviewed him many years ago, and he told me that there's 16 tracks of guitars on that song. And lots of them are acoustic. Smith's songs are packed with sloppy, mixed-in back acoustic guitars, and it just makes this, glorious ringing jumble that was such a unique voice. And it really made me question my dedication to maximum precision on doing doubles.
That's the end of part 1. The conversation continues on our Patreon page. Get access for $1 at patreon.com/acousticguitarplus. The Acoustic Guitar Podcast is brought to you by the team at Acoustic Guitar Magazine. I'm your host, Nick Grizzle, joined for this episode by Elton Bradman. The Acoustic Guitar Podcast is directed and edited by Joey Lusterman. Tanya Gonzalez is our producer. Executive producers are Lyzy Lusterman and Stephanie Campos. Our theme song was composed by Adam Perlmutter and performed for this episode by Joe Gore. If you enjoy this podcast and want to support us, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/acousticguitarplus or find the link in the show notes for this episode. As a supporter, you'll have access to exclusive bonus episodes along with other special perks. And if you're already a patron, we thank you so much for your support.